the Indian Act of 1876 shaped the lives of First Nations peoples for generations. In this video, we'll explore how it was used as a tool of assimilation.
How did the Indian Act 1876 assimilate Indigenous peoples into Canadian culture? The Indian Act was passed in 1876 as a federal law that gave the Canadian government control over many aspects of Indigenous peoples' lives. Its goal and motives were to assimilate Indigenous peoples into European Canadian culture and society, and was unfortunately imposed without Indigenous peoples' consent. The Indian Act has been more than just a law, it has impacted Indigenous communities for over 150 years. To support these communities today, we need to understand the Indian Act and how it shaped the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian government. One main goal of the Indian Act of 1876 was assimilation. The Canadian government sought to control First Nations peoples and essentially forced them to adopt European Canadian ways of life. It aimed to replace their traditional forms of government, identities, and communities with a state-controlled system. The government imposed elected band councils, defined Indigenous identity through legal status, restricted cultural practices, and supported residential schools. These schools aimed to replace Indigenous languages and traditions with European Canadian ways of life. Sadly, the original goal of assimilation resulted in policies that caused significant harm to First Nations communities. Why did the Canadian government create assimilation policies in the first place? The Canadian government created assimilation policies to integrate Indigenous peoples into settler society and increase government control over Indigenous lands, communities, and governance systems. The Indian Act was a key tool used to establish and maintain Canada's settler colonial system by regulating many aspects of Indigenous life. These policies were based on the belief that Indigenous peoples should adopt European Canadian values and institutions, while traditional Indigenous laws, cultures, and governance systems were discouraged or replaced. The Indian Act significantly disrupted traditional Indigenous governance by replacing many Indigenous leadership structures with government-controlled band councils. This reduced the authority of traditional leaders and limited Indigenous self-determination. The impacts of these assimilation policies continue to be felt today, as many Indigenous communities are still working to restore traditional forms of governance and strengthen cultural practices. Together, these sources show that assimilation policies were designed not only to change Indigenous cultures but also to expand government control over Indigenous peoples and their lands. One of the most significant parts of the Indian Act was the government's power to decide who was legally recognized as Indian. Under the Act, some Indigenous people lost their Indian status through a process called enfranchisement, which encouraged them to give up their legal Indigenous identity in exchange for the rights of Canadian citizens. Indigenous women could also lose their status if they married non-Indigenous men. These policies were designed to reduce the number of people recognized as Indigenous and encourage assimilation into European Canadian society. As a result, many individuals and families lost important connections to their communities, cultures, and identities. The Indian Act was also used to restrict important Indigenous cultural practices. Ceremonies such as the potlatch were banned because government officials believed they stood in the way of assimilation. The potlatch was an important gathering where Indigenous communities celebrated traditions, shared teachings, and strengthened social relationships. By outlawing these ceremonies, the government attempted to suppress Indigenous cultures and replace them with European values and customs. Although the ban was eventually removed, its effects on Indigenous communities were long-lasting.
Although many of the assimilation policies within the Indian Act have been changed or removed, their effects continue to impact Indigenous peoples today. These policies were designed to replace Indigenous cultures, languages, and systems of governance with European Canadian ways of life. One lasting effect is language loss. Many Indigenous languages declined because cultural practices and traditional teachings were restricted. Since language is deeply connected to identity, culture, and community, this loss has affected generations of Indigenous peoples. Another ongoing impact is intergenerational trauma. Assimilation policies disrupted families and communities, and their effects continue to influence mental health, identity, and overall well-being across generations. Finally, assimilation contributed to social inequalities that still exist today. Indigenous peoples continue to experience disparities in education, housing, healthcare, and income because of the lasting impacts of colonial policies. Despite these challenges, Indigenous peoples have shown remarkable resilience. Across Canada, communities are revitalizing Indigenous languages, preserving cultural traditions, and strengthening their identities through education, ceremonies, and community-led initiatives. Indigenous youth are also helping carry traditions forward while advocating for self-determination and positive change. These efforts reflect the strength of Indigenous communities and their commitment to protecting their cultures for future generations. Although assimilation policies attempted to erase Indigenous identities, they did not succeed. Today, Indigenous cultures continue to thrive through resilience, cultural revitalization, and hope. These ongoing efforts remind us that healing is possible when history is acknowledged, cultures are respected, and Indigenous voices are supported.
Recognizing the past and present effects of Canada's treatment of Indigenous peoples, particularly through the Indian Act, the Indian residential school system, and other colonial practices, is essential to achieving truth and reconciliation. While reconciliation involves significant action to foster respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, truth entails understanding and accepting these facts. Education is the first step toward reconciliation. Canadians must comprehend how the Indian Act has limited the rights, customs, and self-determination of Indigenous populations. Understanding this past enables people to see why there are still a lot of disparities in society now. Progress calls for more than just awareness. It entails taking concrete actions, like honoring Indigenous customs and cultures, paying attention to Indigenous voices, encouraging Indigenous leadership, and combating prejudice and stereotypes. Governments, organizations, educational institutions, medical professionals, and private citizens all have a part to play in fostering fair relationships built on cooperation and respect. Reconciliation for medical workers entails treating patients in a culturally acceptable manner, acknowledging the impacts of past trauma, honoring Indigenous customs and beliefs, and attempting to eradicate racism in medical settings. For Indigenous patients, these measures can enhance trust and health results. In conclusion, rather than being one-time occurrences, truth and reconciliation are continuous processes. In order to promote justice, healing, and lasting partnerships with Indigenous peoples, all Canadians must be educated, accountable, respectful, and continue to take action.